Ever since the days of Native American habitation, many types of vessels plowed the waters of North America's Great Lakes, which began from large canoes made from hollowed-out trees used by Native American tribes, to 40 to 50-ton barques used by European explorers in the 17th and 18th centuries, to large steel-hulled steamers in the second half of the 19th century. This documentary tells the stories of the progress made over the course of the centuries of ships on the lakes. Each of these vessels' design secrets that led to them having long and successful careers, but also the design flaws that led to them having an unexpected and tragic end. We even look into the progress of the machines and places used to unload and load these vessels. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ivan, and join me today as we discover the evolution of the Laker. The story of the Laker begins thousands of years ago, long before European explorers set foot on American soil, when these large canoes were used by Native American tribes to navigate the waters of the Great Lakes. Some of these large canoes measured up to 35 feet in length. However, a few hundred years later, in the mid-17th century, there was a growing number of French explorers establishing forts on the shores of the lakes. One of the first to explore the region was René Robert Xavier Sieur de La Salle, a French explorer who eventually found his way to North America. Not long afterward, he began exploring the region in order to profit from the abundance of natural resources in the area, especially the fur trade. Soon, he would establish a handful of forts on the shores of the Great Lakes. Almost immediately, he began to design a ship that would be able to transport the goods he would profit off of, since the canoes used by the Native American tribes were too small for this task. His first ship was a 10-ton wooden barque called the Frontenac, launched in 1679, which was named after a fort he had established in present-day Kingston, Ontario. This ship is considered to be the first commercial vessel to operate on the Great Lakes. However, the career of the Frontenac was short-lived, because not long after the Frontenac was completed, La Salle sent a party to present-day western New York to construct a larger ship. When the Frontenac's mooring rope snapped in a storm and broke up on the shores of Lake Ontario. However, this new ship would be significantly larger and more advanced. The Le Griffon. She came in at roughly 45 tons and measured anywhere between 30 to 40 feet, though as fate would have it, just like the Frontenac, Le Griffon's career was short-lived too. On September 18, 1679, Le Griffon departed Washington Island in present-day Michigan, bound for Niagara, when she vanished without a trace on Lake Michigan. The Le Griffon is considered to be the first shipwreck on the Great Lakes. The exact cause of her disappearance remains a mystery, and we may never know what really happened. There wouldn't be another sailing ship to operate on the Great Lakes for more than 8 decades after her loss, when trade routes would be established. As for La Salle, he continued to explore the area and map out the region, until 1684, when he had the task of establishing a French colony in present-day Texas. Things didn't go as planned. In March of 1687, he was killed by what some called a disgruntled follower during an ambush. He was 43 years old. Although the Frontenac and Le Griffon didn't have very long careers, they marked the beginning of maritime trade and transportation on the Great Lakes. Now let's fast forward 140 years to the year 1818, when the very first steamship on the Great Lakes is constructed. The Walk in the Water was a 132-foot, 328-ton steamboat constructed in Black Rock, New York. He was considered by many to be the first steamship to operate on the Great Lakes. He was launched on May 28, 1818, and her maiden voyage was on August 25th of that same year. She ran voyages between Buffalo and Detroit. The Walk in the Water marked the beginning of the steamship era on the Great Lakes, and was the first ship to traverse 3 out of the 5 lakes. She was powered by a 73-horsepower crosshead steam engine, driving 2 paddle wheels at a top speed of 7 to 12 knots. Like most early steamships, she was equipped with auxiliary sails in case the engine shaft broke, though she was not destined to have a long career. On the night of October 31, 1821, just 3 years after entering service, the Walk in the Water was caught by a fierce November gale just outside of Buffalo Harbor. The waves and winds caused the ship to leak uncontrollably. As a result, the ship began to drift towards the shore, and was beached near the Buffalo Main Lighthouse. Shortly after, the swell lifted the ship and pulled her to the bottom. Fortunately, there were no casualties. Maritime trade and transportation on the Great Lakes took a giant leap in activity in the 1820s, with the opening of New York State's Erie Canal in 1825. A 363-mile-long waterway stretching from the state's capital, Albany, on the Hudson River, all the way to Buffalo, New York on Lake Erie. This new waterway allowed ships to travel from New York City on the Hudson to the Great Lakes for the first time in history. This was not the only boom in commercial shipping on the Great Lakes. In 1844, iron ore was discovered in Michigan's Upper Peninsula by surveyor William A. Burt. Almost immediately, iron ore mines were established in the region, and the raw ore was used to make pig iron, which is the equivalent of steel today. By 1852, more and more steel mills were constructed all over the Great Lakes region, and this led to more ships being built to transport the ore. Originally, wooden steamships would haul barrels of iron ore from the Lake Superior region to the steel mills on the lower lakes. But when they reached the rapids at Sault Ste. Marie, the barrels would be unloaded off the steamers and put back on the ship once they cleared the rapids. Until the Soo locks were opened in 1855, the ships didn't need to unload their cargo at the rapids. Schooners and other sailing ships were the preferred method of transporting cargo at that time because they could haul more iron ore than steamers. However, they could only sail on a windy day and were difficult to maneuver. Until 1869, when a brand new Great Lakes steamer changed everything. Launched on November 16, 1869 in Cleveland, the steamer R.J. Hackett is considered to be the first true Laker, with it being the first ship to use the design that most of the freighters and passenger vessels would use for the next century. The Hackett measured 208 feet in length, and originally came in at 749 gross tons. Her design combined the works of both steamships and schooners, with a 380 horsepower triple expansion engine, driving a single screw propeller, and a wooden hull. Most ships back then were made of wood because of the low cost and abundance of lumber in the region. Soon, other companies began producing ships with similar designs and mechanisms, which made the old schooners inadequate. Unlike the Legraphone and Walk in the Water, the Hackett would have a successful 36-year-long career, undergoing several changes over her career, until 1905, when her luck ran out as well. In November of 1905, the Hackett was carrying a load of coal from Cleveland to Marinette, Wisconsin, when a fire started in the crew areas. Since the ship's hull was made of wood, the fire quickly reached the engine room and disabled the ship. Her crew managed to beach the ship on a nearby reef and managed to escape in the lifeboats, where they would soon be picked up by another vessel. The Hackett was a total loss and she burned right down to the waterline. However, even before the Hackett sank, another ship would start a new era for the lake freighter. Launched in 1888, the steamer Hennepin is considered to be the first self-unloading ship on the Great Lakes. A self-unloader is a ship that can unload its cargo using a system of conveyor belts that carry cargo up to the ship's massive cargo boom, where it is swung over to unload. Essentially, how it works is, underneath each cargo hold, there is a chute that can be opened and closed. When the ship is ready to unload, the chute is opened, and the bulk cargo is dropped onto a conveyor belt. The captain can change the speed of the conveyor belt depending on how much cargo is in the holds. There are 2 conveyor belts on each side of the ship, which drop off at a single conveyor belt at the bow or stern of the ship. The cargo is sandwiched between 2 belts as it is carried up to the cargo boom. The cargo boom has its own conveyor belt on it, and it can be lifted up or rotated from side to side. The cargo is then dropped onto large piles on the dock or into a hopper system. Today, almost every ship you see operating on the Great Lakes has one of these self-unloading cargo booms, meaning that they can unload at smaller ports without the need of the old Hewlett unloader, which have since been discontinued. The Hennepin from 1888 was really the first ship to have a self-unloading mechanism, although the design wasn't as advanced as it would be a few decades later. By the 1920s and 1930s, we saw a growing number of new freighters using the self-unloading cargo boom, while others did not and still used the old Hewletts to unload. They were still used into the 1990s, but have since retired. Back then, most of these ships had their boom attached to the forward pilot house, but most of them today have their boom attached to the aft superstructure. If you stand on the shores of the Great Lakes today, almost every ship you will see is a self-unloader, even the ships that are decades old and were not originally self-unloaders. While we may have seen a design trend on the Great Lakes that was successful and is still used today, At the end of the 19th century, there was a brief design trend that proved to be unsuccessful. Lasting from 1887 to 1898, the Whaleback Freighter was a short design trend on the Great Lakes, which led to 44 cigar-shaped vessels to be constructed. Captain Alexander McDougall, a Scottish-born Great Lakes seaman, took note of how difficult it was to tow barges by tugs or other vessels. The Whaleback Freighter he designed would be much easier to tow and or handle. But aside from that, the Whaleback design didn't really have any characteristics that made it better than the standard Laker, since these designs were really only meant to make it easier to tow barges. More than half of the total number of Whalebacks didn't have engines, although some did have engines. Few issues with this design is when fully loaded, they sailed almost fully submerged, and looked like submarines. On the inside, most of the crew spaces were usually awkward, dark, and humid. Plus, with the rounded shape of the hull, the ships lacked real decks for the crew to stand on, which made work difficult. So it's no wonder why the Whaleback design trend didn't last very long, although some stragglers continued service until the 1910s and 20s. By then, they were deemed obsolete. For this next design progression, we need to fast forward several decades after the Whalebacks to the 1970s. For a while now, most ocean-going cargo ships had developed stern bridges, with the main superstructure at the stern of the ship, as opposed to it being towards the center or towards the bow. Even as late as the early 1970s, most Lakers still used the classic design which had been used for just over a century by then. This is when we entered the era of the 1,000-footers. 1,000-foot ships had been around for decades with the SS Normandy and the RMS Queen Mary in the 1930s, but at the same time, the largest Lakers were only around 500 to 600 feet long, until we entered the 1950s with the first 700-foot Lakers, with one of them being the infamous Edmund Fitzgerald. However, it's only 2 decades later that we see the first 1,000-footers. The first 1,000-footer was the Stuart J. Corr, introduced in 1972. A magnificent freighter that is still in operation to this day, measuring just over 1,000 feet in length. And unfortunately, it was the last forward pilothouse Laker ever built. Only a few years later, Great Lakes shipbuilders decided to build ships similar to the open ocean with stern bridges. Today, only about 24 pilothouse Lakers are still left on the Great Lakes. They still remain to keep Great Lakes maritime history alive. Even some of the AAA class lake freighters from the early 1950s, one of them being the Arthur M. Anderson, the ship that was following the Edmund Fitzgerald on the night she sank. Although these freighters look drastically different today than they did back then, over the years, more and more 1,000-footers have joined the Great Lakes fleet, with a total of 13 of them. A few years after the Stuart J. Corr was introduced, 1,000-foot freighters such as the James R. Barker and the Masabi Miner have been built, measuring about 1,004 feet in length. And they are still in active service to this day. As of 2024, the largest vessel on the Great Lakes is the Paul Artgrid, introduced in 1981. She measures 1,013 feet in length, making her almost as long as the Queen Mary, and can transport up to 69,000 tons of iron ore and nearly 65,000 tons of coal. While many of the classic Lakers are long gone, there are just enough of them traversing these waters today, that depending on where you are, you might see one pass by.